The sun beat down on Tahira's back, hot and unforgiving. Dust devils danced across the cracked earth, mocking the empty well in the center of their village. 19 summers had she seen, yet none so cruel as this. The land, once generous, now offered only withered crops and the gnawing pang of hunger. Tahira's hands, stained brown from the soil, clutched a handful of wilted greens, her only harvest for the day. She worried for her parents, their faces gaunt and pale with worry. Her father coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the dryness of the land. Her mother, once vibrant, moved with a slowness that spoke of dwindling strength. Tahira loved her parents fiercely. They were simple farmers, but their hearts held a richness the barren land could not touch. They taught her the value of hard work, the solace of a kind word, and the importance of sharing even the smallest crumb. Now, as famine tightened its grip, these values were tested daily. One sweltering afternoon, a cloud of dust announced the arrival of a cart. From it emerged Tahira's Uncle Habib, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He surveyed the parched fields with a disdainful sniff, his gaze lingering on the few meager vegetables Tahira held. He spoke to her parents, his voice oily and smooth, promising help, offering solutions. Tahira watched, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Her uncle had never offered help before. His visits were always marked by demands, not generosity. Her fears were confirmed as the conversation turned to whispers, then heated arguments. Her mother wept, clutching Tahira's hand. Her father stood tall, his voice trembling with anger, but his shoulders slumped with defeat. The weight of their desperation hung heavy in the air. Finally, her father nodded, a single heartbreaking nod that sealed Tahira's fate. Uncle Habib, his smile now triumphant, gestured towards a bulging sack in his cart. It was filled with wheat, precious, life-giving wheat. He held it aloft, a symbol of salvation in a dying world. Then he looked at Tahira, his eyes cold and calculating. The bargain was struck, a sack of wheat for a young woman's life. Tahira, her heart pounding with fear and confusion, was bundled into the cart. She looked back at her parents, their faces etched with grief, their hands outstretched in a silent farewell. The cart lurched forward, carrying her away from everything she knew, the dust swirling behind it like a shroud. The weight of the wheat, the price of her freedom, pressed down on her soul. The palace kitchens were a whirlwind of activity. Servants scurried, pots clattered, and the air hung thick with the aroma of roasting meat and spices. Tahira, still numb from the journey, found herself thrust into this chaos. Her simple clothes, stained with the dust of her village, marked her as an outsider. The other kitchen maids, their faces hardened by palace life, eyed her with a mixture of pity and disdain. They gave her simple tasks, peeling vegetables, scrubbing pots, jobs that required little skill and offered no comfort. That night, after the grand feast had been served, Tahira received her own meager portion, a small loaf of wheat bread. It was more than she had seen in weeks, but the sight of starving children huddled at the palace gates stirred a familiar compassion within her. She broke the bread into pieces and, ignoring the surprised glances of the guards, shared it with the hungry children. Their small hands, thin and dirty, clutched the bread like precious jewels. Their grateful smiles, fleeting but genuine, warmed Tahira's heart. Unseen by Tahira, a man in simple servant's clothes watched from the shadows. He had seen the disdain of the kitchen maids, the hunger in the children's eyes, and the selfless act of the young woman who shared her own meager meal. This man, though dressed as a servant, was Sultan Fahd, ruler of the land. Grief had etched deep lines on his face. The plague had stolen his wife and children, leaving him with a crown that felt heavy and a heart that ached with loneliness. He often wandered his kingdom in disguise, seeking solace amongst his people, trying to understand their suffering. Later that week, whispers about Tahira reached the Sultan's ears. The courtiers complained about a peasant girl working in the royal kitchens, a stain on the palace's pristine image. They urged him to dismiss her, to send her back to the dust and hardship from whence she came. But Fahd remembered the girl at the gate, the kindness in her eyes, the compassion in her heart. He summoned her to the grand dining hall, not for reprimand, but for a meal. He revealed his true identity, his voice gentle yet commanding. The courtiers gasped, their faces pale with shock. Tahira, equally stunned, curtsied low, her heart pounding in her chest. The Sultan, the man whose power held sway over her life, invited her to dine with him. The grand dining hall shimmered with candlelight. The long, polished table gleamed, laden with silver platters piled high with delicacies Tahira had only dreamed of. She sat across from Sultan Fahd, her hands folded nervously in her lap. The fine silk dress she had been given felt strange against her skin, a world away from the rough homespun she was used to. She stole glances at the Sultan. He was older than she had imagined, his face etched with sadness, but his eyes held a gentle warmth that eased her apprehension. He spoke to her kindly, asking about her village, her family, her life before the palace. Tahira, at first hesitant, found herself drawn into the conversation. She spoke of the parched fields, the empty well, the gnawing hunger that had gripped her village. She told him of her parents, their love, their sacrifices. She even spoke of her uncle, his greed, the bargain that had brought her here. As she spoke, a strange sense of peace settled over her. It was the first time since leaving her home that she had felt truly heard. Fahd listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. He was captivated by her simple honesty, her unwavering spirit. He had grown weary of the flattery and deceit of the court. Tahira's stories, though tinged with sadness, held a refreshing authenticity. He asked about her dreams, her hopes for the future. Tahira, surprised by his interest, spoke of a time when the rains would return, when the land would be green again, when her family would no longer be hungry. They shared stories of their childhoods, of simple joys and quiet moments. Fahd spoke of his children, his voice thick with emotion. Tahira's heart ached for him, for the loss he carried so bravely. She realized that beneath the crown and the finery, he was a man who had known both great joy and profound sorrow. As the meal progressed, Tahira's initial fear gave way to a strange sense of comfort. She found herself laughing at his gentle teasing, her own smile genuine and unguarded. He, in turn, was drawn to her radiant spirit, the spark of life that shone through her simple demeanor. The grand hall, with its towering ceilings and glittering chandeliers, faded into the background. All that remained was the soft glow of the candles, the quiet murmur of their voices, and the stolen glances across the table that spoke of a connection deeper than either could yet understand. The palace gardens were a hidden oasis, a world away from the bustling court. Lush green lawns stretched out, dotted with fragrant flowers and shaded by ancient trees. A marble fountain, its water sparkling in the sunlight, provided a soothing melody. It was here, amidst the fragrant blooms and whispering leaves, that Fahd and Tahira began to meet. Their encounters were brief, stolen moments snatched from the rigid schedule of palace life. They spoke of simple things, the beauty of the gardens, the changing seasons, the stories whispered by the wind. Fahd found solace in Tahira's company. Her presence was a balm to his wounded spirit. He shared his grief, his loneliness, the burden of his crown. Tahira listened patiently, offering words of comfort, her simple wisdom a surprising source of strength. He, in turn, learned of her hopes, her dreams, the simple joys that had once filled her life. He learned of her love for her parents, her unwavering faith in the future, her resilience in the face of hardship. Their conversations deepened, their understanding growing with each shared moment. Tahira, initially intimidated by his royal status, began to see the man beneath the crown. She saw his kindness, his gentle nature, the sadness that lingered in his eyes. Fard, captivated by her spirit, found himself drawn to her honesty and her unwavering optimism. He admired her strength, her resilience, the way she carried the weight of her past without bitterness. Tahira, however, still carried the weight of her insecurities. She confessed her anxieties, her fears of being unworthy of his attention, her worries about her past and the circumstances that had brought her to the palace. She feared betrayal, not only from her uncle, but also from the world she now inhabited, a world so different from her own. She worried she would be seen as an imposter, a simple village girl who had stumbled into a life she did not deserve. Fard listened patiently, his gaze filled with understanding. He reassured her, his words gentle yet firm. He told her that her worth was not determined by her birth or her circumstances, but by the kindness in her heart and the strength of her spirit. He valued her honesty, her simplicity, the qualities that set her apart from the gilded cage of the court. He saw her not as a peasant girl, but as a woman of remarkable character and resilience. Fard held a small, velvet box in his hand. He presented it to Tahira, a gentle smile softening his features. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, lay a simple silver necklace, a single polished stone, the color of the desert sky at twilight, hung from a delicate chain. It was not extravagant, not ostentatious, but it held a significance far greater than its material worth. "This," he said, his voice low and warm, "is a reminder of the light you bring into my life." Tahira's breath caught in her throat. She had never received a gift so precious, so personal. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the necklace from its velvet cradle. The cool silver against her skin sent a shiver down her spine. She looked at Fard, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. She could not find the words to express the emotions swirling within her. He fastened the clasp around her neck, his fingers brushing lightly against her skin. The simple act, so intimate, so tender, sent a wave of warmth through her body. She looked down at the small stone, its gentle glow reflecting the flickering candlelight. It was a symbol of his trust, his affection, a tangible representation of the growing bond between them. Emboldened by his kindness, Tahira began to believe in the possibility of a future with him. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her since arriving at the palace began to recede. She felt a sense of belonging, a sense of peace she had not known she could find within these grand walls. She began to open her heart, to trust in the genuine affection she saw in his eyes. One evening, as they strolled through the moonlit gardens, Fard stopped beneath a blossoming jasmine tree. The air was thick with the sweet fragrance of the flowers, the silence broken only by the gentle murmur of the fountain. He took her hand in his touch sending a familiar warmth through her veins. "Tahira," he began, his voice husky with emotion, "you have brought a joy into my life I thought I would never know again." He looked at her, his gaze searching, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. He opened his mouth to speak, the words hovering on his lips, unspoken yet palpable in the air between them. Tahira held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. For a fleeting moment, the world stood still, suspended in a bubble of anticipation. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a promise of something more, something deeper, something neither of them dared to name. The Grand Vizier, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with disapproval, stood before Sultan Fard. His voice, though measured and respectful, held a sharp edge. "Your Majesty," he began, "we must address a matter of grave importance, a matter that concerns the future of the kingdom." Fahd, seated on his ornate throne, listened patiently, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. He knew what was coming. The whispers had reached him, the hushed conversations in the corridors, the disapproving glances cast in Tahira's direction. "Your fondness for the kitchen maid," the vizier continued, his words carefully chosen, "has become a topic of much discussion within the court. While we understand your need for companionship after your tragic loss, we must urge you to consider the implications of such an unconventional attachment." Two other viziers, equally stern and disapproving, stood beside the Grand Vizier, their silence a clear indication of their agreement. Fahd sighed, rubbing his temples with weary fingers. He had hoped to avoid this conversation, to keep his relationship with Tahira separate from the machinations of the court. "The kingdom needs a strong alliance," the Grand Vizier pressed, his voice gaining strength. "A marriage to a noblewoman, one with powerful connections, would secure our borders, strengthen our trade, and ensure the prosperity of our people." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "This girl," he continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "is not suitable. She is of low birth, with no connections, no understanding of the complexities of courtly life. She is a distraction, Your Majesty, a dangerous distraction that could jeopardize the stability of the kingdom." Fahd rose from his throne, his voice quiet yet firm. "Tahira is a woman of remarkable character and integrity," he stated, his gaze meeting the vizier's unflinchingly. "She has shown me kindness and compassion, qualities that are sadly lacking in this court." The viziers exchanged uneasy glances. They had not expected such a strong defense. The Grand Vizier cleared his throat, his voice laced with thinly veiled warning. "Your Majesty, your personal feelings must not cloud your judgment. The stability of the kingdom must come first. We urge you to reconsider this infatuation and choose a bride who will bring strength and prosperity to our land." Fahd, torn between his love for Tahira and the pressure from his advisers, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He knew they were right, that his duty as Sultan demanded he consider the needs of his kingdom. But the thought of abandoning Tahira, of sacrificing his happiness for political expediency, filled him with a deep sense of unease. He dismissed the viziers, his mind heavy with the weight of his decision. The seeds of conflict and doubt, sown by their words, had taken root in his heart. A shadow fell across the sunlit courtyard. Tahira, tending the palace gardens, looked up to see a familiar figure standing at the gate. It was her uncle Habib, his face creased with a mixture of triumph and malice. Her heart sank. She had hoped never to see him again, to leave the painful memories of her past buried in the dust of her village. He strode towards her, his eyes glinting with avarice. "Well, well," he sneered, "look at you, dressed in silks and finery. Who would have thought a simple village girl could rise so high?" Tahira's hands trembled as she clutched her gardening tools. She knew his visit could mean nothing good. "Uncle," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" he cackled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I came to congratulate my dear niece on her good fortune. I hear you've caught the Sultan's eye. Quite an achievement for a girl who was once traded for a sack of wheat." Tahira flinched at his words, the sting of his cruelty a sharp reminder of her past. "Uncle, please," she pleaded. "I don't want any trouble." Habib's smile widened, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Trouble?" he echoed, his voice laced with menace. "Oh, there will be no trouble, my dear niece, as long as you understand the terms of our agreement." He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "I raised you, cared for you, provided for you. And now it's time for you to repay my generosity." He named a sum, an exorbitant amount of money, enough to keep him in comfort for the rest of his days. Tahira's eyes widened in disbelief. She knew she could never acquire such a fortune. "If you don't comply," he hissed, his voice hardening, "I will tell the Sultan the truth about your past. I will tell him about the lies you've told, the secrets you've kept. I will tell him about your questionable upbringing. And then, my dear niece, your good fortune will come to a swift and ignominious end." Tahira's heart pounded in her chest. She knew he was capable of anything, of twisting the truth, of fabricating scandals to suit his greedy purposes. She was trapped, caught in the web of his lies, her past a weapon he wielded with ruthless precision. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. The fear of losing Fad's trust, of being exposed as a fraud, overwhelmed her. She stood there trembling, the shadow of her past threatening to engulf her newfound happiness. Fad paced the length of his private chamber, the vizier's words echoing in his mind. The stability of the kingdom, the prosperity of his people, these were his responsibilities, his burdens to bear. Yet the thought of sacrificing his happiness, of abandoning the woman who had brought light back into his life, filled him with a profound sense of unease. He loved Tahira, loved her simple honesty, her unwavering spirit, the way she looked at him with eyes that saw not a sultan, but a man. He remembered the stories she had told him, stories of hardship and resilience, of love and sacrifice. He remembered her laughter, the genuine joy that radiated from her like sunshine. How could he condemn her to a life of misery, a life she had so bravely escaped? How could he turn his back on the love that had blossomed between them, a love that had healed his wounded heart? Yet the vizier's words held weight. A political marriage, an alliance with a powerful family, could bring stability to the kingdom, could protect his people from the threats that lurked beyond their borders. He was torn, caught between the dictates of his duty and the desires of his heart. He summoned Tahira, his heart heavy with apprehension. He wanted to explain the situation, to reassure her of his feelings, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He watched her enter the room, her usual radiance dimmed by a shadow of worry. He knew she had seen the whispers, the disapproving glances, the subtle shift in the court's demeanor. He spoke to her of the vizier's concerns, of the pressure he was under to choose a bride who would benefit the kingdom. He tried to explain the complexities of his position, the burden of his responsibilities, but his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Tahira listened silently, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the carpet. She had sensed the growing distance between them, the subtle coolness in his demeanor. She had heard the whispers, the rumors of a political marriage, a marriage that would exclude her, a marriage that would shatter her dreams. She did not speak, did not offer any protest or plea. The fear of betrayal, the fear of being seen as unworthy, had taken root in her heart. She felt a coldness spreading through her veins, a numbness that shielded her from the pain of his words. She curtsied low, her voice barely a whisper. "Your Majesty," she said, "I understand." And with that she turned and left the room, leaving Fad alone with the weight of his decision and the growing emptiness in his heart. The distance between them, once a mere crack, had widened into a chasm, threatening to swallow the fragile love that had blossomed between them. Tahira wandered the palace gardens, the familiar paths offering no solace. The vibrant blooms and fragrant blossoms seemed to mock her sorrow. The weight of Habib's threat pressed down on her, a suffocating burden. She felt utterly alone, adrift in a world that seemed determined to cast her out. She found herself drawn to the kitchens, the familiar clatter of pots and pans, a faint echo of the life she had once known. A kind-faced servant woman, Mariam, noticed her distress. Mariam had always treated Tahira with respect, unlike some of the other servants who viewed her with suspicion or disdain. She approached Tahira, her voice gentle, and concerned. "Child," she said, "what troubles you so?" Tahira, her defenses crumbling, poured out her heart to Mariam. She told her of Habib's visit, his threats, his exorbitant demands. She confessed her fear of losing Fahad's trust, of being exposed as a fraud. Tears streamed down her face, hot and bitter. Mariam listened patiently, her hand resting gently on Tahira's arm. When Tahira finished speaking, Mariam's eyes flashed with anger. "That greedy snake!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. "He has no right to torment you so." Mariam, her face etched with determination, began to formulate a plan. "We must find a way to prove his lies," she declared. "There must be some evidence, something to counter his claims." She thought for a moment, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "The Royal Archives," she said, her voice brightening. "They hold records of everything that has happened within these walls for generations. Perhaps there is something there, something that can help us." Tahira, a flicker of hope igniting within her, grasped at the idea. "But how can we access the archives?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "They are heavily guarded, restricted to only a few." Mariam smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Leave that to me," she said, her voice filled with confidence. "I have my ways." She winked conspiratorially. "Now dry your tears, child. We have work to do." That night, under the cloak of darkness, Mariam led Tahira through a secret passage, a hidden network of tunnels known only to a select few within the palace. They emerged in a dusty, dimly lit chamber, the air thick with the smell of old parchment and forgotten secrets. Rows upon rows of shelves lined the walls, stacked high with ancient tomes and bound manuscripts. The Royal Archives, a repository of the kingdom's history, lay before them. Tahira's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. The search for the truth, a desperate plea against the shadows of her past, had begun. Fahad sat at his desk, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the room. He held a letter in his hand, the crisp parchment heavy with unspoken accusations. It was from Habib, reiterating his demands, his threats growing bolder with each passing day. Fahad's jaw tightened. He had initially dismissed Habib as a nuisance, a greedy opportunist seeking to profit from Tahira's newfound position. But something about the man's persistence, the unwavering certainty in his voice, had begun to gnaw at him. He found himself questioning the circumstances of Tahira's arrival at the palace. He remembered her stories of her village, her parents, the devastating drought that had gripped their land. He remembered the sadness in her eyes when she spoke of her past, the subtle hints of a hidden pain. Could there be more to her story than she had revealed? A nagging suspicion, a sliver of doubt, had taken root in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Habib's sudden appearance and exorbitant demands were more than mere coincidence. He decided to investigate, to delve into the records of his own family history, searching for any connection, any clue that might shed light on the mystery surrounding Tahira. He rose from his desk and made his way to the Royal Archives, a place he had rarely visited since the death of his wife and children. The memories they had made within these walls, the laughter, the shared moments of joy, were too painful to bear. But now, a sense of urgency propelled him forward. He lit a lamp, its soft glow illuminating the dusty shelves, the rows upon rows of bound volumes, each one a testament to the kingdom's long and complex history. He began his search, his fingers tracing the spines of ancient tomes, his eyes scanning the faded script for any mention of a family connection, a lost relative, a hidden truth. He pored over birth records, marriage certificates, and family trees, his mind racing, his heart pounding with a growing sense of anticipation. He knew, deep down, that he was on the verge of uncovering a secret that could change everything. Tahira sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the plain walls of her small room. The royal archives had yielded nothing. Hours had she spent poring over dusty tomes and faded manuscripts, her fingers tracing the brittle pages, her eyes searching for a clue, a connection, anything that could disprove Habib's lies. But the search had been fruitless, leaving her with a growing sense of despair. She reached into a small wooden chest, the only possession she had brought with her from her village. Inside, nestled amongst a few worn garments, lay a woven bracelet. It was a simple thing, made of brightly colored threads, a gift from her mother on her 14th birthday. Tahira picked it up, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns. She remembered her mother's hands, rough and calloused from years of working the land, yet gentle as she tied the bracelet around Tahira's wrist. As she turned the bracelet over in her hand, a small, metallic glint caught her eye. Woven into the threads, almost hidden amongst the vibrant colors, was a small, silver crest. It was tarnished with age, its details barely discernible in the dim light. Tahira held it closer to the candle, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized the crest. She had seen it before, embroidered on the royal banners, etched into the palace walls, a symbol of the ruling dynasty. A memory, long buried beneath the weight of her recent hardships, surfaced in her mind. She remembered her mother telling her stories, whispered tales of a lost royal connection, a family secret shrouded in mystery. Her mother had spoken of a sister, a princess who had defied her family and eloped with a commoner, a farmer who had stolen her heart. The stories had always seemed like fairy tales, fantastical tales spun to entertain a young girl. But now, as she stared at the crest, a chilling realization dawned on her. Could the stories be true? Could she be connected to the royal family? Could this simple bracelet, a gift from her mother, hold the key to her true identity? Fard's fingers traced the faded script in the ancient ledger. He had been searching for hours, his eyes scanning page after page, his mind sifting through generations of royal lineage. He had found records of his estranged sister, the princess who had defied her family and eloped with a farmer. He had dismissed it at first, a tragic tale from the distant past, a footnote in the annals of his family history. But then he had found a record of their marriage, a simple entry in the village register listing the names of the bride and groom, their families, their witnesses, and the groom's name. It was the same as the name Tahira had given him, the name of her father. He reread the entry, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the date of the marriage, the location, the names of the witnesses. It all aligned. All pointed towards a truth he had never dared to imagine. He remembered the woven bracelet Tahira wore, the small silver crest woven into the threads. He had seen it before, a variation of his own family crest, a symbol of a branch of the royal family long thought extinct. He closed the ledger, his hands trembling. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a clear and undeniable picture. Tahira was not a simple village girl. She was his niece, the daughter of his estranged sister, a princess by birth, a rightful heir to the throne. He had found her not through design or political maneuvering, but through a simple act of kindness, a shared loaf of bread at the palace gates. He had been drawn to her spirit, her resilience, her unwavering compassion. He had fallen in love with a woman who by blood was his family. A woman who, by right, deserved more than the simple life she had been given. He realized, with a mixture of awe and gratitude, that fate had brought them together, had woven their lives together in a tapestry of love, loss, and rediscovery. The lies Habib had spun, the threats he had made, were nothing but the desperate acts of a greedy man trying to conceal the truth, a truth that now shone brighter than any lie. The grand hall buzzed with activity. Courtiers, adorned in their finest silks and jewels, whispered amongst themselves, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected summons. Sultan Fahd sat on his throne, his face impassive, yet his eyes held a steely glint. Beside him stood Tahira, her simple dress a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. She looked pale and anxious, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Habib, his face flushed with a mixture of anticipation and unease, stood before the throne, his greedy eyes darting around the room. Fahd raised his hand, silencing the hushed whispers. He held aloft a woven bracelet, its brightly colored threads a splash of vibrancy against the backdrop of the grand hall. "This bracelet," he announced, his voice clear and strong, "belongs to Tahira." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. He pointed to the small silver crest woven into the threads. "This crest," he continued, his voice rising with emotion, "is the crest of my family, a symbol of our royal lineage." He turned to Habib, his gaze piercing. "You knew this, didn't you?" he asked, his voice laced with accusation. "You knew Tahira's true identity, her rightful place in this kingdom." Habib stammered, his face paling. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from one shocked face to another. The courtiers, their whispers now silenced, stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Fahd rose from his throne, his voice ringing through the hall. "Tahira," he declared, "is the daughter of my estranged sister. She is a princess, a rightful heir to this throne. And you," he turned back to Habib, his voice dripping with contempt, "sold her for a sack of wheat, attempting to conceal her true identity for your own personal gain." He held up the letter Habib had sent him, the letter filled with threats and demands. "You threatened her, attempted to extort her, to profit from her royal lineage." He gestured to the guards. "Seize him," he commanded, his voice unwavering. The guards stepped forward, their hands gripping Habib's arms, their faces grim. Habib, his face ashen, offered no resistance. He knew his game was up, his lies exposed, his greed laid bare for all to see. Fahd turned back to Tahira, his gaze softening. He took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Tahira," he said, his voice filled with warmth, "you are home." A wave of murmurs rippled through the grand hall. The courtiers, adorned in their finery, exchanged shocked glances. The revelation of Tahira's true identity hung heavy in the air, a tangible presence that silenced the usual courtly chatter. Tahira stood beside Fahd, her hand still clasped in his. She felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her, disbelief, confusion, a flicker of hope amidst the lingering fear. She looked at the faces around her, the shocked expressions, the whispered exclamations. She had spent her life as a simple farmer's daughter, her hands stained with earth, her days filled with toil. Now, in a single moment, her world had been turned upside down. She was a princess, a royal heir, a woman whose destiny had been hidden beneath a veil of lies and deception. Habib's arrest had been swift and unceremonious. The guards had dragged him away, his protests echoing through the hall, his curses fading into the distance. The courtiers, their initial shock giving way to outrage, condemned his greed, his treachery, his callous disregard for Tahira's life. They had looked at her with pity before, seeing her as a simple kitchen maid, an object of the Sultan's fleeting affection. Now, their gazes held a mixture of awe and respect. She was one of them, a member of the royal family, a woman whose bloodline traced back to the very foundations of the kingdom. Fahd, sensing Tahira's unease, squeezed her hand reassuringly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. He saw the confusion in her eyes, the uncertainty that clouded her features. He knew this revelation was overwhelming, a life-altering event that would change her world forever. He wanted to reassure her, to comfort her, to help her navigate the unfamiliar waters of her newfound identity. He raised his hand once more, silencing the renewed murmurs of the court. "Tahira," he announced, his voice resonating through the hall, "has endured hardship and injustice. She has been betrayed by those who should have protected her, those who should have cherished her." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled courtiers. "But her spirit has remained unbroken," he continued, his voice filled with admiration. "Her kindness, her compassion, her unwavering strength have shone through the darkness, illuminating the true meaning of royalty." He turned back to Tahira, his eyes locking with hers. "Tahira," he said, his voice gentle yet firm, "you are not just a princess by blood, you are a princess by heart. And this kingdom," he gestured around the grand hall, "is yours." A hush fell over the grand hall. The courtiers, their faces a mixture of shock and awe, watched as Fahd took Tahira's hand. He led her to the foot of the throne, the very symbol of his power and authority. He turned to face the assembled court, his gaze sweeping across the sea of expectant faces. He took a deep breath, his voice resonating through the silent hall. "For generations," he began, "my family has ruled this kingdom. We have upheld the laws, protected our people, and strived to bring prosperity to our land." He paused, his gaze settling on Tahira. "But today," he continued, his voice filled with emotion, "I stand before you not as a ruler, but as a man who has found something more precious than any crown, more valuable than any throne." He looked at Tahira, his eyes shining with love and admiration. "I have found a woman whose heart is pure, whose spirit is strong, whose wisdom surpasses any I have encountered in this court." He turned back to the assembled courtiers, his voice ringing with conviction. "Tahira," he declared, "is the rightful heir to this throne. She is a princess by blood, a leader by nature, a woman who embodies the true meaning of royalty." He stepped aside, gesturing towards the throne. "Today," he announced, his voice clear and strong, "I abdicate my position as Sultan. I relinquish my crown, my power, my authority. I give them freely, willingly, to the woman who deserves them more than I." He placed his hand on Tahira's shoulder, his touch gentle yet firm. "Tahira," he said, his voice filled with pride, "I name you Sultana, ruler of this kingdom." A gasp rippled through the hall. The courtiers, their faces a mixture of disbelief and admiration, bowed their heads in acknowledgement. Tahira, her heart pounding in her chest, looked at Fahd, her eyes filled with gratitude and wonder. She had never sought power, never desired a throne. But now, as she stood before the assembled court, she felt a surge of determination, a sense of responsibility to the people of this kingdom, the people she had once served as a simple kitchen maid. She knew, deep down, that she would rule with wisdom and compassion, with the same kindness and strength that had guided her through the darkest days of her life. The grand hall buzzed with excitement. The coronation ceremony had been a spectacle of vibrant colors and ancient rituals. Tahira, now Sultana, stood tall and regal in her ceremonial robes, the weight of her new responsibilities settling upon her shoulders. She had addressed the court, her voice clear and strong, promising to rule with wisdom and compassion, to uphold justice, and to bring prosperity to the land. The courtiers, once skeptical, now looked upon her with respect and admiration. They saw in her not a simple village girl, but a true leader, a woman whose strength and integrity shone brighter than any crown. As the last of the well-wishers departed, Fahd approached Tahira. He stood before her, no longer a sultan, but a man, his eyes filled with a love that transcended titles and crowns. He took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Tahira," he said, his voice low and warm, "I have a question to ask you, a question that has nothing to do with thrones or kingdoms." He looked at her, his gaze searching, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "Not as a sultana, not as a princess, but as a woman I love with all my heart." Tahira's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had blossomed amidst hardship and uncertainty. She looked at him, the man who had seen her worth when others had dismissed her, the man who had given her not only a throne, but also his heart. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding was a celebration, not of power or prestige, but of love and unity. The entire kingdom rejoiced, celebrating the union of a sultana and a man who had given up his throne for love. The festivities lasted for days, filling the streets with music, laughter, and the aroma of feasting. The once barren fields, now nourished by the returning rains, promised a bountiful harvest. The people, once burdened by hunger and despair, looked towards the future with hope and optimism. Tahira, with Fahd by her side, began her reign. She implemented agricultural reforms, ensuring that no one would ever suffer the hardship she had once endured. She established schools and hospitals, prioritizing the well-being of her people. She ruled with wisdom and compassion, guided by the values her parents had instilled in her: hard work, kindness, and the importance of sharing even the smallest crumb. Fahd, no longer burdened by the weight of a crown, devoted his time to supporting Tahira, advising her, and working alongside her to build a kingdom where justice and prosperity reigned. They ruled together, not as sultan and sultana, but as partners, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of kindness and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And so the kingdom flourished, not because of a crown or a throne, but because of the love that bound their rulers, a love that had blossomed from a simple act of sharing bread at the palace gates.